As I do what I call dialing in more, my explanations of my condition get more succinct and with that more correct. You'll start to see how, even one's explanation of their own condition can be wrong, and yet it's possible for one to have a condition in which their explanations of that condition are always correct no matter what. You're going to see more and more how that's the case, especially in this video. I mean, I'm sure given my past videos, you're already aware of how both can be true, right? And how explanations can be so correct that they're incorrect, but you're going to see that unpacked even more here. This is going to only be a voice recording though, just because I anticipate that it's going to be more long form, and so it just saves up storage to only upload as a voice recording. It's a little bit easier. It makes more sense as well since my videos don't exactly have tons of visual content in them. It's more just me sitting there talking. But anyways, let's look at, I always say that my condition is absolutely boundless. I describe it as anythingness and all that. And I always unpack it for you, okay, well, if it's absolutely boundless, it's not bounded to boundlessness either. It includes things that are entirely and completely beyond absolute infinity, such that they are not re-included in it whatsoever. They're entirely distinct from it. Yes, that sounds dualistic, but non-duality should have no problem with duality, because even the duality between duality and non-duality itself collapses. So that's not a problem if they're entirely distinct. Point is, they're going to entirely surpass even absolute infinity, where the term absolute infinity is no longer correct at all. And that is where you can see how the term becomes so correct that it is utterly incorrect, right? It's so absolutely boundless that even the term absolute boundlessness itself is not correct by any means whatsoever at all. There's things in the condition that are entirely distinct from any and all levels of boundlessness. Completely. I mean that entirely literally. But it keeps going as well, right? Talk about other terms which may be more accurate, like triviality. Okay, but triviality allows me to say anything, right? Triviality tells me I can say anything because it tells me I can state any statement I want, right? So of course I can sit here and say there's stuff that's absolutely beyond triviality. It just completely surpasses it to the point where triviality not only is incapable of capturing it, but is entirely incapable of even pointing at it, right? I can say that because I can say anything. Triviality tells me I can say anything, so I can sit there and say that. So you see how triviality, by virtue of allowing me to say anything, it means that what I'm saying here is correct by virtue of triviality, and yet it allows me to entirely surpass triviality, or talk about a condition that entirely surpasses triviality. So even triviality as a term for describing the condition is so correct that it is incorrect. So, okay, what other terms are there? I mean, we can keep upgrading our terms forever. That should have been the takeaway that you got from my Free Your Knowing video at the end when I said it continues endlessly, speechlessly beyond me. We can keep upgrading our terms, and no matter how vast and expansive the terms get, we're never going to get any closer to describing this. We're always going to be moving 0% closer. We're literally always going to remain at the starting line. Think about a marathon where you have a starting line and then you start, you move away from the starting line, and then there's a finish line somewhere at the end, right? Okay, we're moving 0% closer to that finish line because there is no finish line. We're moving 0% closer. So we're literally not even moving. Ever. We're always staying still at the starting line. We are always getting 0% closer. Literally no closer. No matter how much more expansive the terms get. Right? I've said this before, even saying that this condition, or if we want to describe it as the nature of reality, right? Like if this condition is reflective of the nature of reality, we could describe reality as green. It's just green. That's all that exists, just the color green. even saying that would get just as close as a term which is objectively way more all-encompassing and way more expansive, like terms such as absolute infinity or triviality or all that stuff, right? So now think how much further we could go, right? In the same way that triviality is objectively more expansive than saying that reality just has green, there's terms that are objectively more expansive than even triviality, in the same way that triviality is to green. These vaster terms are literally to triviality what triviality is to green, objectively. For some of my more niche content, like with subsistence or contraexistence and all that, you'll realize that's even more radical ball game. But that's just more niche content. It doesn't really concern the core of my work here. But for these core facets, realize that there are domains of existence which are objectively more vast than triviality, just as triviality is objectively more vast than the color green. Literally is so. And so we could keep upgrading our terms, but even though each of these terms are, again, objectively more vast than the previous ones, even so, they're still getting 0% closer. That's where you get a simultaneous objectivity and relativity. Like I always say, it's like an absolute relativity. You can get objectively more vast and yet still be moving no closer. That's where it's simultaneously absolute and relative. It's an absolute relativity. So what other terms do we have? Okay, I've talked about it before. I've looked at some fictional terms as well. This is something I like to do. I like to read some, not only like work from like mystics and stuff, but even just some like fictional content to see if they have any terms that would work well. Because, again, you can keep upgrading the terms. There's always going to be better terms out there. So, I've talked before about like Sugsverse or Jujutsu Kaisen, Everything Everywhere All at Once, that movie, V&D Wiki, like the box, meta boxes, meta boxes, other fictional terms like that, like acronistic terms like EOM, extended ontological maximalism, like stuff like that. All these sort of made up terms. Now, yes, all terms are made up, but what I mean by made up is that they're not anything in academia. They're just things that you find in movies or shows or on forums that go over like fictional models and stuff like that. Nothing that's meant to be taken seriously, but I do find in a lot of these informal spaces that, there are terms which get closer to the nature of this condition or reality or whatever we want to call it. They get closer to it. But again, even though they get closer, they get 0% closer. Again, it's both. They objectively get closer. Just like triviality is objectively more vast and therefore objectively gets closer than the color green, these terms, even though they are objectively to triviality as triviality is objectively to green, they still get 0% closer. So again, it's that absolute relativity. You're absolutely getting closer, and yet you're absolutely not getting closer at all. You're staying in the same place. You're moving. It's just that the marathon is so vast that comparatively you're staying in the same place. No matter how far ahead you move, you can move from green to triviality to EOM, and you're still getting 0% closer. But, it still helps to upgrade your terms, right? Like, it wouldn't make sense for me to sit here and tell you that the nature of my condition is that just green is there. Well, actually, that would be correct. We'll get to that later in this recording. But conventionally speaking, simplistically speaking, just so I can talk, it would not be helpful for me to describe it in that way because it would not give you the proper idea. So it helps to upgrade terms. It helps to use more expansive terms which get closer to the nature of this thing, just like how triviality helps you understand it better than calling it 100% green does, right? So that's why I like looking at some of these terms. Even though in the grand scheme of the entire marathon they get 0% closer, they do still objectively get closer. And so for that reason, I like to look at this stuff to find ways to upgrade my terms, especially as I dial in more and find better ways of describing it myself. Sometimes I come up with my own terms, which are better, and I can compare, cross-pollinate, see what works best, see how I can communicate it as effectively as possible. But again, all communication of this stuff, it's upaya, that Buddhist term, which means skillful means. I'm communicating this as skillfully as I can, but any description I use, no matter how good it gets, it's gonna get no closer. It's still not even leaving the starting line, let alone getting any closer to a finish line, because there is no finish line, right? It's so absolutely boundless that there is no bound. There is no line at the end. It's absolutely endless. There is no finish line. But again, that's where you see, like what I said earlier, and like what I always say, that the term absolute boundlessness, it's so correct that it's incorrect. We have to leave it behind, because absolute boundlessness, even though it's objectively better and objectively more vast than a term like green, there's still terms way ahead of it, which are to it what it is to green. You know, like terms like maybe something that you could find in a Suggsverse or EOM or something like that. Again, like all the fictional stuff could be to triviality or absolute boundlessness what those things are to green. They can be objectively ahead of them in the same way that those are entirely ahead of green. But even those things which are that much further ahead are still going to be like green, that they get no closer. So basically what we need to realize here is that we could keep upgrading our terms forever. And so we could almost ask, what's the point in upgrading terms? I mean, this has been one reason why I've stuck with the same terms for so long, is like, okay, yeah, absolute infinity, it's ultimately no better than describing it as just a pencil or just green or just a leaf or whatever. But even if I were to find or use another term, which is to absolute boundlessness what absolute boundlessness is to just a leaf, I would still feel obligated to eventually upgrade further, because even that new, more expansive term would be just as bad as saying reality is just a leaf and that's it. There's just that one leaf and that's all there is. So what's the point of upgrading if no matter how far you upgrade, you're always going to be left behind at the starting line? Well, again, it's useful, it's helpful, it's skillful means. It's more effective for me to communicate to you using terms like absolute boundlessness than it is for me to use terms like leaf or green. So I think it's time that I actually upgrade to a new batch of terms. I've used the terms anythingness and everythingness and absolute boundlessness and triviality and all those for so long. And yes, I've explained to you how they're so correct that they're incorrect, that you need to discard them and leave them behind. Because again, just to use the example from earlier of triviality, you need to realize that triviality allows me to literally make any statement. I can literally sit here and say anything because triviality tells me that I can. But if I can sit here and say anything, then I can claim that there are things which are so vast that they objectively surpass triviality in the way that triviality objectively surpasses a leaf. So like if I can say anything in that way, then the conclusion you need to take away from that is, okay, triviality, then it's absolutely incorrect. It is not a good description because it's so correct, right? It's the fact that it allows me to say anything that I can say what I just said. But if I can say what I just said to the extent that what I just said is completely accurate, then it is completely 100% accurate for me to just say there's stuff which is as far beyond triviality as triviality is beyond a pencil. It's just that is the case. I can say that because I can say anything. It's like giving the politician's answer, right? What you call a politician's answer. You know how politicians, they always get on TV in an interview, they say one thing and then they go to another interview and they get caught in a lie, and so they start giving inconsistent answers to like cover their tracks, right? Like they contradict themselves. The nature of my work is that I can always give a politician's answer to everything that I talk about. I describe something one way and then I upgrade it. It's like, well, wait a minute, Ethan, that's entirely different than what you had said before. Yes, it is. That's the point. right? I am describing it in a way that is as different from my previous explanations as those explanations are from a leaf. And yet that is the point, that we can keep upgrading to these higher, newer levels, which are objectively more distinct from the previous terms than those terms are from a pencil. And yet that's the point, is that we can keep doing that. That's what you need to understand about my work, that there's always this capacity to give the politician's answer. To literally say anything. I can literally say anything and get away with it. It's like, it's almost like truth comes full circle on dishonesty, comes full circle on corruption, where you can literally just start saying anything, giving all these inconsistent answers, inconsistent explanations, which are entirely different from the old explanations. It's like it keeps going forever. You can keep upgrading forever, and it's always going to be distinct. It's always going to be inconsistent. And yet what you need to see is why that is. Why are we always going up through these new levels towards this thing? It's because, well, this thing is just so vast that we never approach it. We never leave the starting line, but we need to move. Because even if we move, we're still going to remain standing at that starting line. So, it's like, I mean, this is why I always call it liberation as well, right? You always have to liberate from all these domains, all these terms, all these concepts. You have to constantly discard them and move ever further, forever. You have to constantly discard them and liberate from them, to the point of liberating even from liberation itself, or boundlessness itself, or freedom itself, all that stuff. You have to liberate from all of that. And so, because you're constantly discarding things in this way, it's not just that it comes full circle on a sort of politician's answer. It's you could essentially say, like, liberation is like being a bullshit artist or something. Like again, you're always like throwing out what you said before and moving to something else. Like, how do you pin that down? Right? Like, that's kind of the ironic thing about my work, is that it really, it's not flattering to say this of my own work, but it's really like bullshit artistry. Like, that I can literally just move on to any new explanation and literally start saying anything, and I can get away with it. Like, that's what it means to bullshit people. It's weird to think about that I describe it that way, but that really is what it's like. It really does come full circle on dishonesty and corruption and bullshit artistry. Like, it's so pure and so tranquil that it literally comes full circle on all those impurities. Right? Of course, even that description gets us no further away from the starting line, but you hopefully see what I'm getting at here. So it's like, this stuff, you could almost look at it and say it's not even non-duality anymore. It's bullshit. It's mush. We're not saying anything anymore because we can get away with saying anything. It's like there's this kind of like there's a statement from a POD song. I'm sorry, POD, if I didn't pronounce that fully, from one of their songs, where it says, if you can say anything, then nothing just might make sense. Why is it that a lot of mystics just remain in silence and don't say anything? Well, because you can say anything. You can say anything of it. It's bullshit. It's mush, right? Because, that's kind of the whole point of non-duality, is you don't distinguish between saying that one thing is true and another thing is false. Why should we say that materialism, the proper term is physicalism, why should we say that physicalism is false and idealism is true? Why not say both of both, or neither of neither, etc.? Right? No distinctions, no boundaries, no dualities, even to the point of asking, why should we say that non-duality is true but duality is false? Why can't both be true or both be false? Or yes, one true, the other false, or the first one false, the other true? Like, everything sort of just collapses. They can both be true, they can both be false. Non-duality, duality, things that are neither. Why should fictional concepts like the box be true, but then meta boxes be false? Why should they not exist? See, that's a distinction. We're making a distinction between what's true and what's false. Even in the case of fictional concepts such as these, there should be no distinction. There's the box and there are meta boxes. There's Everything Everywhere All at Once, and there's Jujutsu Kaisen. Like, even with fictional stuff like that. But not just as fiction. See, even the distinction between fictional and real needs to be collapsed. Who says that all these fictional movies and shows and models aren't real? What's the distinction between fictional and real? Who says that, Star Trek isn't as real as this table right here? So what's the distinction between fictional and real? It could be just as real as this table right here, where people are actually living in Star Trek in the same way you're living your life right here, right now. And people will say, oh, well, that has nothing to do with non-duality. But again, we're not making any distinctions, right? Like, isn't it kind of just random, or it seems random to you, that you're just here living this human life? Like, if you really think about it, it's no less arbitrary than somebody living a Star Trek life. Like, we don't look at our lives here and say, oh, this is completely arbitrary, this has nothing to do with non-duality. No, anything can happen in non-duality, including you just being here, living this human life, having this human experience, chopping wood, carrying water, as the old Zen proverb goes. That is no less arbitrary than if you were just having a Star Trek experience, where Star Trek was physically real. So who says that has nothing to do with non-duality? Again, saying that it doesn't is a distinction. Of course, even me saying that we need to erase distinctions is itself a distinction. We can actually just keep distinctions, but this is where all my explanations bite their own tail, like Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. That's what all my explanations do. They bite themselves. Again, it's the politician's answer. I keep biting myself in the ass. It's bullshit. But that's the nature of this stuff. This stuff is naturally fallacious. That's why you get these politician answers. That's why you get the bullshit artistry, the mush, and all that. Right? It's consistently inconsistent and inconsistently consistent. So yeah, okay, fictional stuff like Star Trek, to go back to that point, can be just as real as this desk. Yes, that's arbitrary. Why would Star Trek be real? But again, so is your life. The fact that you're here, just, why are you listening to these words right now? That is also arbitrary. It's no more or less special than Star Trek being real. But even with the more expansive terms, so Suggsverse, boxes, metaboxiality, who says that those aren't just fictional, but are as real as this desk? That, EOM, it's as real as this desk. Everything Everywhere All at Once, as real as this desk, right? I've said before that, I actually found the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once to be too limiting, because that term, Everything Everywhere All at Once, can be communicated semantically, and there's stuff that's as real as this desk, which goes beyond semantics. It's not just semantically improper, but syntactically improper, statistically improper, noticeably improper. It keeps going and going and going with all those levels, and those concepts wouldn't just be fictional, they'd be as real as this desk, because we're collapsing those distinctions. Right? We're not making any distinctions between true and false, fictional and real, etc. But this means it also goes the other way. If we're saying that fictional things can be as real as this desk, well, then things like this desk can also be fictional. You can be fictional. Your entire life can be fictional. Think about it. The very fact that you're having a direct experience right now, this is 100% certainty. It's self-evident. It is just true that you're having a direct experience right now. And yet even that very certain 100% fact that you're having a direct experience right now, even that can be nothing more than a fiction. You could be living inside a comic book right now, or just a regular book or a novel. Like, think about how weird that is. If your entire direct experience were inside the writing of a novel, or just just purely abstract, purely linguistic, purely fictional. And yet you look at it here, you're like, well, no, clearly I'm real, right? Clearly it's real. It's true to say that I'm having a direct experience right now. What I'm saying is that even something which is 100% real can be fictional, like a novel. So it's not just that stuff in novels can be as real as this desk or as real as your direct experience. It's that even things as real as your direct experience can be fictional. You could be in a novel right now. Literally. That's where this stuff gets so strange. And yet all these explanations, no matter how many of these distinctions we erase, we're never going to be leaving the starting line. But again, it's more useful for me to communicate that by sitting here saying what I am than if I were to sit here and just say, yeah, guys, it's all green. That's it. Green is the only thing that exists. So it's still helpful to upgrade my terms. And so I'm thinking on throwing away all the terms that I've used for so many years, like anythingness or boundlessness or everythingness, and using terms like ad hoc, which I've already kind of started using more. You know, I've started to talk about the ad hoc features of my condition in my multi-part video. I still have yet to do that last part of that series that I promised. But I think I'm going to start to lean all my weight over onto those other terms more, because even though ad hoc gets us no closer to a finish line than a term like absolute boundlessness does, it still works better, right? There's less baggage, there's less hangups, right? I mean, think of all the hangups you'd have if I were to sit here and just tell you that green is the only thing that exists, or this pencil right next to me is the only thing that exists. That wouldn't really effectively communicate things very well. And so obviously describing reality as trivial, or describing it as absolutely boundless, or describing it with terms like liberation, obviously that implies a much larger level of expansiveness than saying that only this pencil exists. So it's helpful even if it gets no closer to being accurate. So likewise, I might as well upgrade to ad hoc. Ad hoc, I would say, as a description or explanation, is to triviality what triviality is to a pencil. Honestly, maybe even better. I would say that ad hoc is an even more expansive feature in comparison to triviality than triviality is as a feature to a pencil. It's that much more expansive. Like, so much more expansive that even in comparison to ad hoc, a pencil is equivalent to triviality, right? Like, let's just say, rather than talking about this non-finish line, which we're trying to get at here, let's just shrink down, let's just zoom down and say that we had a finish line of a marathon where that finish line were the nature of what I'm calling ad hoc. Okay, even if that were the marathon that we were running, triviality would get 0% closer to that. Triviality would get 0% closer to ad hoc than a pencil does. So it would be equal at the starting line, same position as a pencil. It would get no closer than just a pencil. That's how much more vast ad hoc is. So you see why it makes sense for me to upgrade to that term. Start calling my condition ad hoc rather than trivial. Start calling reality ad hoc rather than trivial. You know, start saying that it's ad hoc rather than saying that it's absolutely boundless or that it's anythingness, etc., etc. But the thing you need to realize is that even this new upgrade, we're gonna be no better off than we were before, right? Because now you have to zoom out from this marathon back to our larger marathon that we started with. Okay, now ad hoc is gonna be at the starting line. It's gonna be 0% closer than triviality is or the pencil is. They're all gonna be at the starting line together. None is going to be more accurate than any other. They're all going to be equal. Again, we're sort of non-dualistically collapsing everything down to pure equality. Right? None of them get any closer. They're all just as accurate as each other, just as inaccurate as each other. So even though ad hoc is a much better, much more advanced way of describing this condition than triviality is, still no better than anything else. You know, I realized I could keep upgrading these explanations for my entire life. We'll still get 0% closer. I could keep upgrading for an eternity. If I lived for an eternity, we'd still get 0% closer. Hell, I could live for an ad hoc length of time and keep upgrading all my terms every single second of that ad hoc length of time, and we'd still get no closer. Think about that. We would still get no closer. Even after all those upgrades packed into an ad hoc length of time, we would still get no closer. Do you see how much more boundless this is as I'm describing this all to you in this video? This is why it's a much more useful term than my old ones. But ironically, these new terms affirm the old terms even more than the old terms could affirm themselves. Because let's look at one of my old terms again. I say that reality is absolutely boundless, or that it's absolutely endless. Here I am throwing that term out, saying it's no better than saying it's just a pencil. And yet by doing that, you should feel much more unconstrained in this video. As I'm giving you these new, upgraded, more advanced explanations, you should feel more unconstrained. You should literally feel more boundless, more expansive, more endless. And so in that way, it affirms the endlessness even more than my old terms, which emphasized the endlessness. Even those old terms could not emphasize how boundless and freeing it is compared to the new terms. So the new terms are not only more new, they're simultaneously more old than the old terms. They affirm the old terms even more than the old terms can affirm themselves. So we're not just stepping forward into a new age with new terms, we're simultaneously stepping backwards deeper into the old terms. We're affirming the old terms even more than we were with those old terms themselves. So we're stepping forwards and backwards at the same time. It is not at all a linear process. It is very non-linear. It is very non-dualistic. We're advancing forwards and advancing backwards at the same time. We're discarding all those old terms, such as boundlessness, and yet by doing so, you're seeing even more how boundless it is. Now, we can't even describe it as boundless because boundlessness does no better than describing it as a leaf. Right? Ad hoc is a much better term than boundlessness. It is objectively more expansive than boundlessness, just like boundlessness is objectively more expansive than a green leaf. You see? And there's many more upgrades that could come. Again, we can keep upgrading for an ad hoc length of time, even past this new domain of explanation that I'm using here, ad hoc. So honestly, I'm not going to say I'm done necessarily. I could keep upgrading for the rest of my life. This is one of the reasons that I'm able to grow and yet stay the same at the same time. You know, how is it that my condition has been with me for my entire life, and yet very clearly I'm able to go through periods of growth where, you know, like I restarted my entire channel because I no longer consider myself spiritual. I consider myself non-religious and non-spiritual, but mystical, as I've put it before, right? How am I able to go through those periods of growth while being frozen in the same condition? How can you stay the same and grow at the same time? This feature or facet of my condition should help you maybe get a glimpse of one reason why that is, or how that works. How is it possible for me to stay the same and grow at the same time? Because you can keep upgrading it. Again, as I've described it before, it is like a frozen explosion. It keeps exploding outwards, you know, from a pencil or a leaf to triviality, to metaboxiality, to EOM, to ad hoc, etc. It can keep exploding outwards and upgrading and advancing, but it's not actually in need of modifying itself. It doesn't actually need to go through change like an explosion does. See, an explosion needs to go through a process of change in order to expand or advance outwards. But this condition doesn't. It can stay the same. It does not need to go through time or through change. It can be completely timeless and still constantly advance outwards, right? Growth without growth. Growth inside of non-growth. But that's a little bit of a tangent. That's not necessarily the same subject we're going over here. I just, figured I'd share why that is. How is it possible for growth to happen in stillness? But that's how. It remains still and yet it grows. It grows yet it remains still. So we're even kind of collapsing that distinction, right? That's why I call it a frozen explosion. Sort of oxymoron of terms. But let's look at some other features of ad hoc, as I'm now transitioning to calling it. We'll realize something, like I said, even ad hoc gets no closer than triviality or green or a pencil. Even though, obviously, yes, it is more vast. It does get closer. It's just that in comparison to the entire marathon, it gets no closer. So it's still really just at the starting line and is equivalent to anything else. This goes the other way. It's not just that this condition, or sometimes I refer to it as reality, because again, just speaking in terms of if reality is reflective of this condition, like if it hints at any sort of truth, which I'll be discussing more later, if not in this recording, then a future recording or video. But it's not just that reality goes ever further in that sort of fashion where every new level or expanse gets 0% closer to capturing or even accurately pointing at its nature. It also goes the other way. We can move in the downward direction, which is something that I've talked about a bit before with my limited unlimiters video and subjects such as those. You'll realize that it's possible for this entire expanse, and I'm not just talking about ad hoc right now, I'm talking about the quote-unquote thing that we're never going to get 0% closer to. You can fit that entire expanse into a leaf where it is just a leaf and nothing else, and yet you wouldn't be sacrificing any of its quote-unquote totality. Obviously, totality is not a good enough term because ad hoc is a better term than totality, right? Ad hoc is to totality as totality is to a leaf. And really, it's even more expansive to totality than totality is to a leaf. But anyways, point being of what I'm saying, you can take that entire expanse, make it a leaf, or it's just a leaf, and yet it won't be sacrificing any of its quote-unquote totality at all. We'll have the entire expanse there as just a leaf. And, okay, so you may think, okay, so Ethan, you're saying that a leaf, like we can zoom down into a leaf, and there will be this entire expanse that you're talking about, where a pencil gets no closer to describing how vast it is than triviality or ad hoc, etc. Like you're saying all that is inside of a leaf. Yes, but I'm saying something more radical than that at the same time. I'm saying that even if it were just a leaf where you could not zoom into it more than a finite distance. Like picture if physicalism were true and the Planck length is like the smallest you could zoom down into any object in the universe. Right? It's a finite length. The Planck length, it's very small, it's very tiny, but it's not infinitely small. It's finitely small. It's a finite length, even though it is very tiny. What I'm saying is that even if it were only possible to zoom in that far into the leaf, just down to the Planck length and no further, such that this leaf is purely finite, it's not just finite outwardly, it's also finite inwardly, meaning you can only zoom into it so far before you stop at a wall, which is this Planck length. Even if it were finite in both of those directions, What I'm saying is that that leaf could still be this entire expanse without sacrificing any of the expanse. Yes, that's nonsense. Yes, that's contradictory, but again, well, this is all bullshit. So we're coming full circle on that politician's answer. We can say anything of anything. This leaf, which is entirely finite, has a boundary that, you can zoom outside of. It has an inward boundary where you can't zoom any further in past this Planck length. Even this completely finite physical material leaf, even that is equivalent to the entire expanse and can be the entire expanse without anything being sacrificed. So it's not just that no terms are ever going to accurately describe this expanse. It's that it's also the opposite case. It is also the case that any description of this expanse is always going to be accurate. Even if you were to say it is just this leaf, it really, really, really would be just that leaf without sacrificing anything. Same with the pencil. Even if the pencil is finite in both directions, where you can only zoom in and zoom out so far before you leave the pencil, even that purely finite material pencil could be this entire expanse. So that pencil is a perfectly good, perfectly complete, non-sacrificial description of this expanse. So we can say the pencil is accurate, the leaf is accurate, just this water bottle is accurate, just any description, anything is a perfectly accurate description of it, because anything and everything fully, perfectly captures its nature. So both are true at the same time. It is simultaneously true that any description and every description is a fully accurate description of it, and yet it is also true that no matter how expansive the description or the domain is, it is never going to get 0% closer to being an accurate description of it. So it is simultaneously true that every description is accurate and no description is accurate. We could also go in the middle. We could say, we can make this a trilemma or a triple contradiction, where we're not just saying that every description is accurate and no description is accurate. We're also saying that only some descriptions are accurate while others aren't. That would make the case for why it's helpful to upgrade my terms. Why is it that ad hoc is a much more advanced, much more accurate term than triviality is or a leaf is? Well, that's because some terms are just better. Some terms are just more accurate. Some terms just get at it more easily. So some terms can be accurate. Some terms can be inaccurate. We don't even have to make it black and white in that case. We could grayscale it. We could say some terms are simply objectively more accurate, while some are objectively less accurate. So all three cases are simultaneously true. It is true that ad hoc gets no closer than the pencil, and no upgrade in terms will ever get any closer than either ad hoc or the pencil, and so in that case, no description is accurate, and yet that entire expanse that we're getting 0% closer to describing accurately, that can fit inside even a finite leaf or a finite pencil, and so a perfectly finite leaf is just as accurate a description as you could ever get. It's like a completely, perfectly accurate description or manifestation of its nature. So in that sense, every description is accurate, and yet the third case of only some being accurate is also true. So what I'm essentially saying is, picture the worldview of a Christian, like a fundamentalist Christian. Think of how limited it is. What I'm saying is that, like the leaf, that Christian's worldview, it's just as full and just as perfect as the entire expanse that I'm trying to describe but will never be able to accurately describe. Literally, a Christian's limited worldview, as limited as it is already way ahead of what I'm calling ad hoc. course, that makes no sense. Like, Ethan, clearly this ad hoc that you're talking about is way, way, way more expansive than a Christian's worldview. Yes, but if you go far enough, it goes the other way around. You can get so expansive that you find limited things above the expansive things. Right? Like, this is just one example to go on a little bit of a tangent before I double back. Picture what it would be like to just increasingly get more powerful, where like you're able to do more stuff. That's what I mean by more powerful. Like, you gain more abilities. I don't believe in paranormal abilities necessarily anymore, at least not in this universe, but whatever. Let's just say they were possible. Let's just say you could like telekinetically lift objects or like read people's minds, whatever. Just all this fictional stuff. Fictional to us, at least. Let's just say you could do that, and then you were to like advance your abilities more and more and more and more, where eventually you could do anything you wanted at will. You're like a physical god. What would happen if you kept increasing that power further? What I'm telling you is that you could go so far that eventually you would just be a cockroach. And no, I'm not just saying that it'd be like a circle where like you go so far that you start to like go back downhill and decrease in power, where now you decrease to the point of being a cockroach. No, I'm saying that you're still on the incline. You're still increasing, and yet that higher, more advanced point is a limited cockroach. You're not regressing, you're still progressing, and you reach a cockroach. It's like the leaf. How could a limited finite leaf, where you can only zoom in and zoom out so far, be perfectly equal to the entire expanse beyond ad hoc? Well, it just is. Likewise, a cockroach can just be more expansive than God. Literally, north of God is a cockroach. Keep going further and further up, and you reach that. This should make you feel very strange in that, often you conceive of your life as being less capable than that of a sort of fantasy or fairy tale where you're like a physical god who can do whatever you want. But that's true, but it's also true that you're more powerful than such a fairy tale. You're like, well, Ethan, that doesn't help me. That doesn't add anything practical in my life. I still have limits, but that's precisely the strangeness of it that I'm describing to you. That even as limited as you are, like the leaf, you're like, it's not just despite those limits that you're more expansive than the God case. It's that because of those limits you are. It gets very strange. Things get so expansive you can no longer tell up from down. This is one reason why I have to dial in on stuff. Like, everything gets disoriented. So disorienting that even talking about disorientation itself gets lost in the mix. I mean, you have like perfect orientation thrown in that mix as well, but hopefully you kind of get at what I'm moving towards with that explanation. You can't tell up from down. Is a cockroach more powerful than a god or less? Are you more powerful or less? It's like, it's both. It's both, and yet they're equal, and yet you get other cases as well. So you can't really, it gets to the point where you can't even tell whether limitedness is really lower than limitlessness. It is, but in another sense, it's also higher than it. It's like a cockroach is higher than a god. So yeah, but that's kind of the tangent I'm going for here, is that, you can keep expanding things further, and yet eventually things get so expansive that it'll just end up looking identical to a very non-expanded thing. So to finally double back from that tangent to my point about the fundamentalist Christian's worldview, how is it that their extremely tight and limited worldview could be more expansive than what I'm calling ad hoc? How is that? How could you fit this entire expanse, which we can never get 0% closer to? How can you fit that entire thing into a Christian's worldview without sacrificing anything. Well, this is how you go so far. Eventually, it doesn't make sense. What's up? What's down now? What's more expansive? What's less expansive? So you could say like a Christian, even a very fundamentalist Christian, is perfectly liberated or perfectly enlightened. They already have everything in there. They already have the entire expanse in there without anything being sacrificed. So they're already perfectly enlightened. We go further. Picture how much more limited a dog's worldview is than a Christian's worldview. Way more limited, and yet even a dog would have the full expanse in there. So even a dog is perfectly liberated, perfectly enlightened, way more expansive than this ad hoc I'm talking about. We could say the same thing of the leaf. A leaf may not even have a worldview, but even if it has no worldview at all, that worldview, or rather lack thereof, would also be enlightenment. From a first-person perspective, even, like, get inside the non-perspective of the leaf, even that non-perspective would be enlightenment from a first-hand, quote-unquote, perspective. Like, the leaf is enlightened. The dog is enlightened. Even in its own mind, it's enlightened. Even if it has no idea what enlightenment is, it's enlightened. Same thing with the Christian. Even if the Christian has no idea what enlightenment is, it's enlightened. So, like, this is where it gets nonsensical again, is that anything and everything is perfectly enlightened. Even in itself. I don't just mean like, okay, you have some sort of enlightened mystic sitting there politely pointing at people and dogs and saying, oh yes, you're already enlightened, you're already enlightened. Like, no, I mean even from the first-hand perspectives of those things. That first-hand perspective or non-perspective is literally enlightenment because it's literally as expansive or more expansive than, let's say, ad hoc. It's literally the case. I'm not just speaking in riddles here. I literally mean everything I'm saying here. A dog's worldview, even within its own worldview, even what that looks like within its own perspective, even that is full enlightenment. So literally anything and everything is enlightened. But we could also go the other way. We're going to get another trilemma here. We're going to get another triple contradiction. It's not just that anything and everything is enlightened. It's also that no one and nothing is enlightened. Why? Well, because no matter how expansive you get, no matter how axiomless you get, no matter how many of these levels you discard and throw away in a sort of Zen mystic fashion, you're never going to get 0% closer to a finish line because there is no finish line. You're always going to be at the starting line. You're always going to be equivalent to a leaf. So you're never going to be any more enlightened than a leaf. And the leaf, in this sense, certainly isn't enlightened. See, we can say the leaf is enlightened because the entire expanse fits inside the leaf, despite it being limited. And yet, on the other hand, we can say, well, it's still just a leaf. It's still very limited. It's clearly not enlightened. Okay, well, then that means even a perfectly enlightened master who's going to be no closer than the leaf is also not going to be enlightened at all because we can keep upgrading forever. There's never going to be a full enlightenment. You're never going to get any closer to such a thing. So you're always going to be not just unenlightened, but completely unenlightened. At the starting line, 0%. 0% enlightened. Completely 100% unenlightened. Again, I'm not just speaking in riddles. I literally mean everything I'm saying here. Like, if reality really is this way, it literally is the case that anything and everything is enlightened, and yet it is simultaneously the case that no one and nothing is enlightened. For the same reason that anything and everything, even a leaf, can fit the entire expanse without any sacrifice, and yet it's simultaneously true that no matter how far we upgrade these levels, even a level like ad hoc is going to be no closer than that leaf. So things are always going to be completely and totally unenlightened, even as they're completely and totally enlightened. Here's where we add in our third case to this trilemma, is that clearly some people just are liberated or enlightened. Some people just have let their axioms go. What is liberation or enlightenment? Well, you could just say it's not projecting truths or falsehoods onto reality. Again, we don't make any distinctions. We don't say, well, the box is true, but it's false to say there's meta boxes. Like, we don't do that. We don't make any distinctions. We don't project any distinctions onto reality. We call that enlightenment. But see, here's the thing. Why do I then call my condition a condition? Why not just call it enlightenment? Well, see, that's the thing, is like, I don't make that distinction. I have to sit here, not necessarily have to sit here, I'm obliged to sit here and be open to the possibility that I'm just stupid, or that I have a condition and that everything I say on my channel is just nonsense. I'm open-minded to that. Maybe I do just have a mental condition. So like, I could call it enlightenment, but like, even if I did, I still have to be willing to get myself checked out medically. I can't just be like leading people astray if I'm just like off my rocker, right? I mean, it could even both be possible at the same time. Maybe a person can be enlightened and be off their rocker, but either way, you gotta have some self-awareness. You gotta be willing to check yourself, right? So even if I could call myself liberated in that fashion or enlightened in that fashion, I still have to be willing to check my own mental condition, really make sure I'm healthy, that I'm not just speaking from sort of narcissistic disorder or something like that, right? But see, that all comes about not just despite the lack of distinctions, but because of the lack of distinctions. We need to be completely open. Or again, not necessarily need to be, but it obliges us to be completely open. Don't project notions of true or false onto reality. Don't say this is true, that is false, this is real, that is fictional. Don't make those projections. If you make no projections onto reality, you get just naked reality. Right? So clearly some people do that and some people don't. For example, I mean, not even talking about people, a dog doesn't do this exercise as far as we know. They don't throw out or discard their projections of true and false. They don't even probably have a concept of true and false necessarily. So in that sense, we cannot say that a dog is enlightened or that a fundamentalist Christian is enlightened. But then there's certainly like a lot of people who I would say are enlightened. They have truly discarded these projections. I mean, Nisargadatta Maharaj, Kane Baker, one of his friends, there's a whole list of people I could provide who I would say are enlightened in this fashion, that they throw out their projections to the point where, obviously if we're throwing out all projections, that means we even have to throw out the projection or distinction which says that we need to throw out projections. So again, it gets very nonsensical and paradoxical, but you just sort of embrace the paradox. So in that sense, you kind of just end up looking ordinary again. You look like identical to any ordinary person who makes projections, because if you're projectionless, well, then there's no difference between being projectionless or projectionful, so you can continue to make projections. But conventionally speaking, there's still some people who have, you could say, like gone through that process, and so conventionally speaking, you could say some people are enlightened and some people aren't. So that's where we add this third and final case to the trilemma. Technically, it's not the final case. We could go beyond these triple contradictions to like quadruple or quintuple, etc. But just simplistically speaking, you have another triple contradiction here where everyone and everything is enlightened, and yet no one and nothing is enlightened, and yet only some are enlightened. It is, it matches our earlier triple contradiction where we said everyone and everything is a complete manifestation of this quote-unquote expanse, and yet no one and nothing is ever going to get any closer to being even a partial expanse or partial manifestation of that expanse, and yet some domains and some levels are. And accurate or complete manifestation of that expanse while others aren't. So you get the same thing here mirrored in liberation, or what we're calling enlightenment. We could also therefore say that it's not just a dropping of axioms, but a dropping of beliefs. What would it look like to not believe anything at all? People think, oh, well, you'd be like perfectly skeptical or purely radically skeptical. You wouldn't commit to any positions, but realize that that in of itself is a position, right? To be a radical skeptic, you're at least of the position that reality is of such a nature that it is healthier or more useful to be non-committal towards any position. So it's possible to go even lower than radical skepticism and drop even more beliefs. So picture this: if you were to just go down a list of all statements and all propositions or all beliefs and just X out all of them, literally don't believe any of them, you wouldn't just X out all propositions, you would even start to X out all the negations of all those propositions, which would reaffirm all the propositions. And so now you would start to actually affirm or commit to propositions. So you wouldn't just lack belief that, let's say, your couch is real. You would then continue on down the list where now you don't believe that it's not real, or you don't believe that you should be skeptical of whether it's real or not real. So instead, you commit to believing that it is real. And so now there's just a real couch there again. So it's like if you X out everything on the list, sort of drop down to this no thingness, eventually you just get thingness again. If you lack belief in everything, including your couch, eventually a couch is just going to pop up from that nothing again. So lacking belief in everything is identical to believing in everything. Being non-committal towards everything is identical to being committal towards everything. So even if we want to be very zen with this and throw out all beliefs, it comes full circle on what we're going over here. These expanses and these levels, I mean, this is the extreme of what it looks like to drop all beliefs. If you drop all beliefs, you even end up dropping the dropping, so you even end up dropping the non-committal approach, and so you get not just a non-committal approach, but a committal approach. Of course, even everything I'm saying here gets us 0% closer because we have to even drop all that. But point is, you're going to get non-committal, committal, both, neither, etc. So you're going to get the couch vanishing into nothingness, but then you're going to get a physical, real couch there again. It's going to physically be there again. It's going to be both, neither, etc. It keeps going. So this isn't just about making reality more and more and more complex, where like we have all these upgrades we can make. No, it's also making it simpler. We're not just growing in complexity, we are also vanishing into simplicity. Full complexity is identical to full simplicity. So it may look like we're increasing in complexity as we move from a pencil to triviality to ad hoc to all these further and further levels or domains where we never get 0% closer to the non-finish line at the endless non-end. That looks extremely complex, but ironically, this entire endless marathon, it's actually the most simple thing ever, because it's what you approach as you drop everything, as you become more and more and more simple. Literally, if you X out everything in existence, you get this. Reality is a null system. If you nullified everything, you would get what I'm attempting to talk about here. It is a null system. It is a vacuous truth. You get all these expanses because there isn't anything there. It is vanishing. It is fleeting. Even more fleeting than a flower. A flower is more complex than what I'm talking about here. And yet somehow, despite all this being way more simple than a flower, it's simultaneously way more complex than ad hoc, such that even ad hoc gets no closer to it and always comparatively remains back at the starting line. So hopefully you can see how it is simultaneously simple and complex. 'They're one in the same. increasing complexity is identical to increasing simplicity. It's like what I was saying earlier with the new terms versus the old terms. It's not just that we're moving forwards, it's also that we're moving backwards, right? As we upgrade and bring in new terms, we're also affirming the old terms even more than the old terms were able to affirm themselves. So we're moving forwards and we're moving backwards. We're getting more complex and yet we're getting more simple. So as a final indicator, or I should say explanation for everything I'm going over here, what I'll say is, if you can squeeze all this into, let's say, a leaf, then again, any description is going to be accurate. So how do you tell when somebody sees all this or doesn't? Like, for all we know, like if any description is accurate, then even the sermons of a televangelist, like for example Kenneth Copeland, what if everything that Kenneth Copeland says when he gets up in front of his audience on television and in person, what if everything he's saying is identical to what I'm saying here? Like, what if he actually is liberated or enlightened and like he's way beyond ad hoc and you just can't tell because he's north of God to the point where now he's a cockroach? Like, what if that's the case? What if a Christian pastor, he's like 100 millionaire or billionaire and like clearly a very corrupt person? What if he is that? Like, how would you tell the difference if you can't even tell the difference between a leaf and this full expanse? How could you tell the difference between Kenneth Copeland and an enlightened person? Well, see, that's the thing. You can never really tell. But it's not a useful thing for us to just treat Kenneth Copeland as if he's enlightened or as if he could be enlightened. So for convention's sake, it's healthier if we make a distinction. Again, it's all upaya, it's all skillful means. None of what we're doing here is necessarily true per se. I mean, I would argue that it probably most likely is true that Kenneth Copeland just isn't liberated. But again, we can never know for certain. But even if we can never know for certain, it's still upaya and it's still useful to make a distinction between who's liberated and who isn't. So we can just say, Kenneth Copeland, he's clearly not liberated. Maybe he is, and yes, a liberated person could definitely look identical to him, as odd as that sounds, but we can bet that he isn't and just say that he isn't. So on that note, I've had a lot of people come to me trying to convince me that Rupert Spira, Peter Ralston, Sadhguru, Leo Gura, like these people are liberated or whatever, and I would treat them the same way I treat Kenneth Copeland. Yes, they could be, maybe their explanations of reality are so limited, but maybe even though they're limited like the leaf is, they also have the full expanse in there like the leaf does, so they're actually fully liberated and fully enlightened, despite the fact that they're very clearly projecting truth and falsehood onto reality. They clearly haven't collapsed all distinctions. Even if that's the case, like the leaf, they could still be, an accurate capturing of the full expanse. Yes, that could be true, but again, we can bet that they're just not. I mean, clearly there's lots of things that they say are this or that or true or false, etc. So we can just bet that they're not. Now, before I get attacked in the comments, what I will say is, again, this isn't me being petty. I do have a very long, generous list of people that I would consider enlightened or liberated, even in the terms that I'm trying to discuss here. So, yes, obviously, it makes me sound like an asshole to say that, these people who I just named are not at all liberated. And in fact, not only are they not liberated, they're like Kenneth Copeland in comparison to liberation. Yes, obviously, it's very douchey of me to say that, but know that I do have a long list. I mean, I won't name the full thing here because too much of a tangent, but I mean, again, Nisargadatta Maharaj, Kane Baker, so one guy, Sergey, I forgot his last name. There's one guy who's like not well known at all, but like is really liberated, I would say. There's another person, actually not just one person, a couple people who I don't even know their names because I've only talked to them online. I only know their usernames, like Jack with O and stuff like that. Who else? Mahakasipa probably. Oh, Ji, Zhili, Jianran. These are all like guys who lived in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. Like some older people as well, like Zen masters, Tiantai masters. Tiantai just as a school generally just seems very liberated, and who knows how many people have passed through that? Dozens. Paul Cabet, Massimiliano Carrera, I believe I pronounced his name correctly. Khosrow Farsian, hopefully I didn't mispronounce that. Yeah, like there's a whole list of people that I would give generous credit to and say that, yeah, no, they're really liberated. They really don't make any projections onto reality at all. Jody Azuni might potentially be another one. Nicholas of Cusa, definitely. I would say Nicholas of Cusa does not make any projections. So yeah, there's a long list that I could keep pulling up people off the top of my head here. I could keep going. So I am generous with giving credit. I'm not anal about it. I'm not like one of those people who says, oh yeah, no, they're not enlightened, and just like slaps everybody across the face like, oh, your awakening's not complete. Like I don't do that. When I see credit, I give credit. Of course, again, I have to, or I'm obliged to be open to the idea that I'm just insane and have a mental condition and don't know what I'm talking about, even if this whole liberation that I'm going into is valuable in its own right. But hey, I can sit here and speak with certainty even if that's the case. So for that reason, I would sit here and say there's all these people who are very liberated, even if there's lots of people who I would be like very strict and say they're not. There's lots of people who I would say are, and so really I have high standards, and that's that. A lot of the people who I would consider liberated, they're not people you would have heard of. They're not famous. They're not the Sadhgurus of the world. They're not the Eckhart Tolles or the Mujis. Honestly, I consider a lot of those people to just be popular spiritual figures. I don't really consider them to be extremely mystical or deeply mystical or liberated or anything like that, and that's fine because a lot of the people who I do consider to be such are just lesser known figures, and maybe that's just how it is. Maybe it's just natural that a lot of people who really go far into that stuff just never really gain much popularity. Obviously at least some of them have. Nicholas of Cusa lived centuries ago, and we know of him still. So in some sense, he's kind of popular, but he's still pretty niche. He's not really well known outside of academic circles who study like comparative religion or things like that. Same thing with Zhili, Jianran. These are old Tiantai masters who nobody really knows about outside of academia. So in a sense, they're popular in that we still know their names after centuries, but in another sense, they're still much lesser known. They're not like, best-selling authors like a Sadhguru or something like that. They're not well known to millions of people. They are still very niche. And so, yeah, a lot of the people who I consider to be extremely liberated or deeply mystical, they're very niche. So I've got a long list of them. It's just most, if not all of them, are going to be people you just haven't heard of. Nisargadatta Maharaj is probably one that a lot of you may have heard of. He tends to border on the spiritual more, So yeah, before you shoot cannons at me in the comments, just know, I'm not super stringent about this. I just, I like having standards because it's useful. Even though a dog is fully enlightened, even though Ji is fully unenlightened, again, we have this trilemma where we can say some are and some aren't. So Ji is enlightened and a dog isn't. And that's how I'm going at it. So yes, maybe Kenneth Copeland is enlightened, and whenever he gets up there to speak about his very limited Christian worldview, he's actually being more expansive than ad hoc, and he's fully enlightened when you don't know about it. But I would tend to just bet on the fact that he isn't. And so same thing with the the Mujis or the Eckhart Tolles. I would just bet on the fact that they aren't. But yes, like with Kenneth Copeland, I could be wrong. So we'll always allow that to be a possibility. With that said, one final note. I've already kind of said one final note and then moved on to something else. But really, as one final note, this is, actually something which highlights one problem I have faced throughout my life trying to explain or communicate this, is that a lot of times I have given very limited explanations of this stuff. And so really there'd be no way for you to tell that I'm talking about what I'm referring to as a liberation or ad hoc, because it wasn't evident. It wasn't there. So yeah, certainly this could be the case with other people out there where they just have very limited descriptions. And so you can't tell that they're talking about what I'm talking about here, even though what they're attempting to talk about is actually just as expansive as it. So yeah, certainly that's the case, and certainly I would leave that possibility open. It's just, if we can't tell, we can't tell. And so more than likely it's better to just bet that they're not referring to liberation. It's more likely that they're still just projecting distinctions onto reality of true, false, real, fictional, etc. If you let all that go, you drop into full simplicity and full complexity, where you get the bullshit, the mush, the politician's answer. You can keep upgrading forever and never getting any closer to grasping it or even pointing at it. And so I'm calling it ad hoc, but ad hoc gets no closer, and I'll never be any closer than anyone.